I'm going to make some brief introductory points about internationalization of the curriculum at home in a global context. And then Professor Balin will speak more specifically about some programs that he's been involved in directly. Let me begin. So we're in a situation where historically, I think, internationalization, certainly across Europe, but also I think in other parts of the world, that internationalization has been very much associated with recruitment of international students, and having international students in the classroom has been a very important factor. Partly this is to do with income that's associated with international students, but also it's been used by in some countries to help the diversity of the classroom. So the second thing that's been a major factor has been the mobility of students, encouraging students to travel to other countries as part of their program. And the third has been the teaching of courses in English. Partly this is to promote English language programs for international students in other countries, but also it's been facilitating some sort of development in the classrooms, different types of programs. So I was just talking about this screen here. Now, if we look at the kind of diversity that we now have in the context of European universities, we're in a situation where we've got a lot of diversity, partly through migration, population change, and we need to think about the cultural diversity in our classrooms in a very broad sense. So we have people from different socioeconomic backgrounds, different religious backgrounds, languages, ethnicity, and we also have to bear in mind changes in the population, changes in the way that we think about diversity, including sexual orientation, gender identification. The Black Lives Matter protests from last year have all caused a rethink about the way we work with students in our universities. So we may be seeing students who are, as you can see, there are a list of some of the diversity in the university context. Now, we may have refugees or students who are classed as international. They may, if in certain countries like Canada or Australia, they may come from Indigenous communities. They may be first in their family to attend university, or they may have disabilities which we can see or not see. So there are very, very different types of students that we're faced with in the university these days. This is particularly the case in universities based in cities, but not necessarily. So I think we have to think about diversity in a very different way. It also means that we have to think about internationalization in a very, very different way. And having said that, I think we also need to think about what we mean by international students. So if we could go to the next slide, the idea that we can continue to think about international or home students in this kind of binary divide that we have is very difficult to sustain. We need to bear in mind that great diversity that we have in our classrooms. And of course, we need to think also about intersectionality. Not all people, students will have a range of different cultural backgrounds, will have a range of contexts that they come from. So they may be the first in their family to attend university, but they may also have their own family, they may have a disability, and so on. I think it's the way we think about diversity and cultural differences needs to be informed by a broader awareness of the kinds of students that we have in our classroom. Now, it may not be quite so diverse in Japan, but depending on the kind of university that you're working in, you will have similar diversity, some of which is not visible. So a lot of this kind of classroom diversity that I've been talking about is not visible to us. We can't look at the classroom and see for example, differences in faces, which tell us where people come from, because we may have first or second generation migrants, we may have people from different religious backgrounds, which are not, they don't wear particular clothes to show that those differences. So we need to think carefully about our understanding of diversity and cultural difference. If we move to the next slide, this affects how we think about the rationales for curriculum internationalization. So there's a kind of pragmatically based rationale or a values-based rationale. In pragmatic terms, we need to think about the skills and understandings that students will need in the way they move forward in their lives, how they can perform in the workplace, for example. But equally, the values-based rationale causes us to think about ideas of global citizenship, ethics, justice, equity, poverty reduction, and global issues such as those human rights and sustainability and so on. And we need to help students develop the kinds of attitudes which will allow us to apply knowledge and abilities to those kind of the values-based context that we see there. If we move to the next slide, we can see that the Council of Europe has even tried to build this into a model for competencies required for democratic culture and intercultural dialogue. So we've got values, attitudes, skills, knowledge, and critical understanding that they've identified, which will be needed as we move forward in this kind of values-based situation. I don't have time to talk about that in detail, but if you look at the next slide, there are the references there are easily accessible, and there's lots of useful information there. The next slide shows us that the pragmatically based rationale is focusing around global problems and the need to cross those boundaries to develop international and intercultural knowledge, and that we need communication skills to allow that to happen. So this is why we need to think about curriculum internationalization. And then we now see that the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals cause us to think both in terms of values-based and pragmatically based causes for internationalization. Moving to the next slide, we know increasingly that internationalization is not simply about education abroad, because it's a privilege for a very, very small number of students around the world. And the global estimate of 2% of students able to have a mobility experience as part of their program is very, very small. So we need to think about mobility adding value to internationalization of the curriculum. The curriculum itself needs to be the focal point of our efforts. And if students have an international experience, then that's an added bonus. The next slide talks about further misconceptions, really, that we need to think about internationalization not only to do with other countries, but as you'll see from my early slide there, the kind of diversity in the classroom means that we need to think about cultural others in a very different way, and we need to work on the values, attitudes, and relationships that we can use to help us develop those intercultural perspectives. So it's not simply about other countries, it's about different cultures. And we need to develop the kinds of knowledge, skills, and perspectives that an internationalized curriculum can bring. And if we use internationalization as a term, we think about moving bodies, whereas in fact it's changing the mindset, changing our approach and our ways of thinking that is more important than simply going to another country. Of course, going to another country can help, but it's very important to bear in mind cultural differences at home. So if we look at the next slide, we'll see that whether this is perceived as a 6 or a 9, it depends on which side of the picture you're standing on. So being able to go and think about the way other people are perceiving things is the key element of of the idea of internationalizing the curriculum at home. So Jos and I, on the next slide, we devised a definition of internationalization at home. It's important to look at some aspects of this. We specifically say that this must be purposeful, integrating international and intercultural dimensions into the formal and informal curriculum needs to be purposeful. We need to do it with a purpose in mind. It will not happen automatically. We need to think about how this is going to be available to all students, and not simply those who are able to travel. But the domestic learning environments means that students can learn from all kinds of international and intercultural contexts within their home learning environment, not simply within the university. So how can we create opportunities for students to experience international and intercultural dimensions, maybe thinking about different institutions or different companies or different organizations which come from different cultural backgrounds, that we can help to support our students in gaining those intercultural perspectives. Now, if we move on to the next slide, we'll see that in a blog for the European Association for International Education, with Tanja Reifenrath, we wrote a blog and tried to explain in more detail what internationalization at home means. And I can't go into this in great detail because of little time, but if you look at the next slide, we will find that this is where you can have a look at that blog if you would like to. Again, the focus is on intercultural as well as international. If we move to the next slide, we see that, yes, that internationalization of the curriculum is relevant for all disciplines, not simply the usual, which we might think of, such as business or people who are working with people in other countries. So it's relevant for law, for example, because of international law or copyright or trade agreements. It's relevant for natural sciences, working with people across the globe in laboratories or in writing research articles together. Teacher education, we'll see increasingly varied classrooms, heterogeneous classrooms. And in medicine, for example, we have a situation where doctors and paramedics and people in health professions are working with clients and patients from different cultural backgrounds. So the internationalization of the curriculum, if we bear in mind that diversity, the intercultural element of it, is definitely relevant for all of our disciplines in universities. So on the next slide, it's up to the academic to think about this for their particular discipline, for their particular students, think about the learning outcomes and how they will be assessed to ensure that they're achieved. So thinking about how we can provide also a guided opportunity for our students to reflect on their experiences of this kind of cultural otherness is very, very important. And at the heart of it is thinking about reducing the idea of something being normal. Nothing is normal, it's just different. We have different contexts and people have different experiences and come from different cultural backgrounds. So going back to what I was saying earlier about the curriculum, we have the two kinds of curriculum that we're talking about today. The formal assessed curriculum with intended learning outcomes. We need to talk about what students will know or be able to do that they couldn't do before. We need to think about how the teaching and learning process can facilitate this and how the assessment will then make sure that the students can demonstrate that they've achieved those intended learning outcomes. So this is what we mean by the formal curriculum, that which is assessed. And an example on the next slide from a paper that I wrote with David Killick, my colleague, thinking about how you can internationalize existing learning outcomes rather than having separate international learning outcomes is very important. So here we tried to help our colleagues look at their existing learning outcomes and see how it might be changed to provide a more intercultural context. So we added, in this case, in a multicultural society, or relevant to the global professional environment of their discipline. So this caused people to think differently about how they articulate their learning outcomes. Now, I don't mean to make it sound as though that's very easy. I'm just trying to give some examples here, and there's more information in that article if you're interested. So this is not an easy thing that we're trying to do, but it's very, very important for all of the reasons that I mentioned earlier. On the next slide, we can see that the other side of curriculum that we need to think about is the informal, the non-assessed curriculum. How can we create an international and intercultural experience on our campuses? And here are just a few examples of this. These are from my own university, some of the activities that we did. It can be academic with, for example, seminars and exhibitions, for example, or it could be more just fun with festivals and films and music and so on. We need to get the students involved as part of this and helping them to develop ideas through their various clubs and societies as well. So the next slide, I've used this term interculturalization rather than internationalization, because I think we need to think about how we create the potential for students to question their own assumptions, acknowledge that there are those alternative viewpoints and cross-cultural boundaries, extending their knowledge and understanding by respecting and valuing diversity as essential for living and learning in a changing society. And as I said earlier, helping them to see that there is no such thing as normal. It's just different. How can we relate differently to people who we perceive to be different from ourselves in whatever ways they are? The next slide shows some readings which may be of interest. Two books from my series on the left from Betty Lesk and Jude Carroll, and two forthcoming books which follow some similar lines by Janine Gregerson-Hermans, Karen Lauritsen, and David Killick and Monica Foster. Of course, this is really trying to give you a perspective from a European and Western context, and it's important to imagine how this then would be applied in a Japanese context. Of course, the kind of diversity in Japan, diversity is increasing in the cities, obviously, but it may be that we need to think about the kind of diversity that is less visible, as I mentioned earlier. So if we move on to the next slide, thank you very much for listening. I'm sorry about the confusion at the beginning of the session. I hope you were